This is Western European Politics and Transatlantic Relations since 1945, and this is Lecture 9 entitled Economic Superpower but Military Pygmy. And today I want to consider Western Europe in the 1990s and the extent to which the end of the Cold War actually affected the situation in Europe. And on the first slide, I want to think about the importance of the end of the Cold War as a moment in international history. The first point, a revolutionary moment, question mark. The reason why I put that there is that when I first started studying international relations, early 1990s, I think the assumption was that something very profound had actually happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1991. I think there was a sort of supposition that this was a crucial kind of moment in the evolution of international history. I think since then some historians have perhaps questioned this, and they've pointed to the fact that although the Soviet Union disappears, an awful lot of the features of the international system, which were very much present during the Cold War, kind of continue into the post-Cold War period. Foremost among them, and in some ways surprisingly, we've already talked about this in our discussion class, but NATO, the Cold War organization par excellence, that does not disappear simply because the Cold War comes to an end. In fact, the organization persists and gets bigger at the end of the decade, with the admission of 3 new members from Eastern Europe in 1999. Similarly, the United Nations, the organization founded at the end of the Second World War, in many ways there was an expectation that now that the Cold War had come to an end, the United Nations would perhaps be able to perform more effectively now that the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer consistently blocking each other's resolutions. But the UN itself, I think it's important to note, was not fundamentally reformed once the Cold War comes to an end. So the membership of the United Nations Security Council and the 5 permanent members, they stayed the same. So there is no fundamental change there. The European Community, again, another important institution that comes about. I think you could make a strong argument as a consequence of the Cold War and the fact that Western Europe was facing a common external enemy in the shape of the Soviet Union. Well, that too does not disappear. And again, we'll come back to that point in a moment. And then there are other institutions as well, International Monetary Fund, the GATT, which becomes the World Bank. In other words, there are a plethora of international institutions and organizations which very much continue, even though the Cold War has come to an end. Then the actual structure of the international system, that too does not, you could make the argument, that too does not fundamentally change simply because the Cold War comes to an end. In particular, the division between North and South, the rich North, the impoverished South, that does not fundamentally change simply because the Soviet Union disappears. I mean, as a final point, a question of a new Europe, and again, we might come back to this point, but the idea that the kind of European project was suddenly finding momentum at the beginning of the 1990s. So how much really did change? And I think it's in this context that there were kind of 2 groups of thinkers, at least these are the categories that I tend to use at the beginning of the 1990s. I think the first group I label the optimists, and I think foremost among them was President George H.W. Bush. This is the first President Bush, president from 1989 to the beginning of 1993. He memorably says with the end of the Cold War, we were now entering into a new world order. And as I say, this is a time of optimism. And there were several reasons why people thought that we were going to be entering into a new, more stable, more prosperous era. One I've already mentioned, that the United Nations would perhaps be able to function in the way that its original architects had intended. The fact that the United States found itself in a hegemonic position at the end of the Cold War meant that it was now in a position to perhaps enforce a degree of of stability. Moreover, Western Europe would continue its path of integration, and you would see a deepening, if you like, of transatlantic institutions, crossing the divide. So there was this idea that this transatlantic partnership would be cemented as a consequence of the end of the Cold War. And for those who were looking for evidence to support these claims, the 1990 Gulf crisis, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and the United States basically assembled an international coalition to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, that seemed to indicate that, yes, there was the potential for these kinds of international policing actions. It should also be said that the United Nations actually authorized military force to deal with the situation, which again seemed to sort of strengthen the case that the United Nations could actually begin to function reasonably effectively. The Soviet Union in 1991, under the leadership of Gorbachev, did not actually block the operation to liberate Kuwait. So those were the optimists. On the other hand, in contrast, you have a group of naysayers, the pessimists, and I would say chief spokesman for this view was the likes of John Mearsheimer, international relations realist, writer, who publishes a fairly well-known article beginning, I think it was around 1992, sometime around then, entitled Back to the Future. And his argument was that we were not entering into a new world order, but actually what was happening was that you could look forward to greater instability, and he argued that the Europe which was going to emerge at the end of the Cold War was going to bear a stronger resemblance to the Europe of the 1930s rather than the Europe that had been sort of frozen during the Cold War. So Mearsheimer disagrees with the view, if you like, of somebody like Francis Fukuyama, who said we've now reached the end of history. He says, au contraire, history had been frozen for the duration of the Cold War, but now that it was over, you could expect it to restart. And the argument was based on the idea that without the common external threat of the Soviet Union, you could look forward to a renationalization of European politics. Furthermore, the United States, now that it was no longer having to contain the Soviet Union, would almost certainly withdraw from Western Europe and assume a more isolationist position. Furthermore, as I say, with this renationalization of European politics, relations between Western European states were almost bound to deteriorate. You could look forward to an increased likelihood of ethnic conflict in the old Soviet Empire, greater levels of instability across Europe, and whereas the optimists could point to the Gulf War of 1991 in support of their case, the pessimists pointed to the breakup of Yugoslavia at the beginning of the 1990s, which resulted in a series of very nasty, bitter ethnic wars in the former Federation. So this was the situation, as I say, at the beginning of the 1990s. Just a couple of words about the Bush administration before I take on to Clinton. I think it's fair to say that Bush was very much a foreign policy president. We talked a little bit about the role that he plays in terms of German unification. In 1990, he oversees the peaceful end to the Cold War, and as we already mentioned, he masterminds this international coalition to liberate Kuwait in 1991. So Bush has, I think most historians agree that Bush had a fairly good foreign policy record, and in 1991 his popularity ratings were sky high, sort of 90% approval ratings, and I think the assumption was that his re-election was almost certain. Of course, things did not quite turn out that way. The Democrats nominate a relatively young figure. In fact, I think I'm right in saying Clinton, to date, is still the youngest president to actually hold office. So they nominate a relatively young man, governor of Arkansas, as their candidate for the presidency, and Clinton mounts a very effective campaign in 1992. Clinton's critique of Bush was that Bush had been far too interested in fighting wars in the Middle East and foreign policy, but he had not been paying enough attention to America's domestic problems. In 1992, the US economy enters into a recession, and Clinton, I think it's the unofficial campaign slogan for Clinton in 1992 is, "It's the economy, stupid." So Clinton promises that he will be far more concerned with America's domestic issues. So in a sense, Clinton seems to be articulating, in a way, a more isolationist foreign policy. And I think it's fair to say that Clinton was not especially interested in foreign affairs, interested in foreign policy. As I say, he'd been governor of Arkansas, which was not a state in which foreign policy or foreign affairs was going to be something that would be on the agenda of the governor of Arkansas. Clinton does, in the course of the campaign, reference Yugoslavia. He sees this as perhaps one potential area of weakness in terms of Bush's foreign policy record, and Clinton implies that were he to become president, that he might be more willing to intervene in the wars in Yugoslavia. One other thing to say about Clinton in terms of his transatlantic sort of connections is that Clinton had actually spent some time in Europe. He'd actually studied, he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he had studied at Oxford University in the UK. So, he'd had contact with Europe, he'd been to Europe, he knew Europeans. But as I say, he was not a president that was particularly concerned about foreign policy. I should say that in his first year as president in 1993, things do not get off to a particularly good start for a variety of reasons, but Clinton presides over a couple of quite significant foreign policy failures, the most spectacular of which is the situation in Somalia. Clinton inherits this mission from Bush when he becomes president at the beginning of 1993. Bush had sent American troops into Somalia on a humanitarian mission. The mission, though, goes badly wrong in 1993. There's a big firefight in Mogadishu. A load of Americans, I think American Marines, or I can't remember what they were exactly, but anyway, they end up getting killed. And it ends as a sort of foreign policy fiasco. And there's a similar situation, another crisis involving Haiti in the Caribbean, which again Clinton doesn't handle particularly well. All of which seem to indicate that foreign policy was not going to be Clinton's forte. In terms of the broader transatlantic relationships, at the beginning of the 1990s, as I say there, surprisingly little actually changes in Europe. And one way of considering what actually happens, Lundestad, for example, argues that what you essentially see is that the Europeans reissue their invitations to the United States. In other words, the Europeans make it clear that they want the United States to continue to have a strong presence in the European security system. And I think a number of kind of historians and writers have made this point. I mean, sometimes they sort of describe this process in different ways. Jeffrey Sloan, for example, talks about a renegotiation of the transatlantic bargain. One of my old teachers, Ian Clark, talks about the 1990s and viewing it as a process of peacemaking at the end of the Cold War. But either way, there's this view that although the institutions might have to be reconfigured slightly, nonetheless, there's this general desire to maintain a kind of strong transatlantic relationship. In terms of America's relations with particular European countries, the United States, UK relationship, the so-called special relationship between the two countries, that did appear to weaken. In fact, if you picked up any British international relations journal in the early 1990s, almost invariably there would be articles entitled "The Death of the special relationship. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One was that Clinton's relationship with the British Prime Minister John Major was not good. John Major was a conservative, Clinton a Democrat. The Conservatives Conservative Party in Britain had actually given some support to the Republican Party in terms of advice on campaigning and things like that. And Clinton knew about this and was not impressed by that. So yeah, relations between Britain and the United States were not particularly good. In contrast, there was evidence that the United States had now come to view a united Germany as being America's principal partner in European affairs in the early 1990s. In fact, I think it's Bush, but Bush extends an invitation to partnership in leadership to Germany with Chancellor Kohl, which Kohl is very careful to sort of reject. Kohl does not want other countries to view Germany as being too strong in its sort of leadership credentials at this stage. There's a general worry that other countries might be concerned or worried if Germany begins to pursue too much of a vigorous policy. Then there are a series of trade disputes which sort of bedevil American-European relations throughout the 1990s. Again, these weren't anything particularly new. You'd seen something similar in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, but it sort of attested to the fact that there were underlying areas of kind of competition between the United States and its European partners. However, you do also see the establishment of the World Trade Organization, so the GATT is sort of elevated to being a permanent organization, which also reflects, I think, that the Clinton administration very much embraced globalization in the 1990s. That Clinton had basically believed that an open trading system was going to be in the best interests of the United States and the global community as a whole. And in terms of the sort of trading system, probably the biggest and most important component of that trading system was the sort of North Atlantic area, the trading system between the United States and the European community in the early 1990s. Again, we talked about this before, but there was also some discussion about Germany's role within this European system, and one of the points that we made is that there was particular emphasis on integrating a united Germany into European institutions, and Chancellor Kohl himself talks about Europe facing a choice between a Germanized Europe or a Europeanized Germany, and obviously opting for the latter. And it's in this context, of course, that we see the acceleration of European integration in the 1990s. So in 1991, you have the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which then results in the establishment of the European Union in 1993. And that's significant. First of all, it's a more tightly knit sort of quasi-European federation. Moreover, in the Maastricht Treaty, there is this desire, or I should say ambition, to establish a common foreign and security policy for the European Union, a CFSP. In other words, the European Union was going to develop into a strategic actor in world politics in its own right. Having said all that, the actual process of integration from the beginning was not particularly easy. As I say, there some governments remained sceptical. Unsurprisingly, I think the British were the country which were least enthusiastic about this process of integration. Indeed, if you look at the story of Brexit, a lot of it cannot be traced back to the early 1990s. Some of the figures who were very much involved in the sort of Brexit debate and campaigning for Brexit, they were, I suppose, establishing their sort of political careers around this period. Nonetheless, Britain does sign and eventually ratify, with some difficulties, but eventually the British Parliament does ratify the Maastricht Treaty, but the British government did actually secure an opt-out from the social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty. So Britain was not bound by the various requirements included in that part of the treaty. Also, unlike most other EU member states, Britain was not obliged to participate in the establishment of a single European currency. So again, the British managed to secure an opt-out on that. But it wasn't only Britain. Denmark too originally reject. I think it was in a referendum, but the Danes voted against ratifying the Maastricht Treaty, although eventually they did tweak it in a way that Denmark come fully into the European Union. But as I say, yeah, there was this discussion of a common foreign security policy, and this idea of a European defence identity begins to solidify these years. Again, we discussed a little bit about that. But there was definitely this sort of ambition for the EU to play a weightier role on the world stage. Moreover, the failures, and again we'll get onto this in a moment, but the relative failures to establish, to intervene, let's say, effectively in the Balkan Wars in the earlier mid-1990s, illustrated that, I suppose it illustrated the EU's relative military weakness, and also the EU's high level of dependence upon the United States, and that was something that various EU governments felt that this was something that needed to be rectified. In 1998, the new British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, signs the Saint-Malo Agreement with the French government, led by Jacques Chirac, which commits both countries to boosting their sort of defence capabilities, cooperating in the area of defence, in order to sort of strengthen Europe's defence capacity. The one thing that clearly doesn't happen in the 1990s is that the United States does not actually retreat into isolationism. So in that sense, the worst forecasts of the realists at the beginning of the decade didn't appear to be coming to fruition. The United States, again, we talked a little bit about this in our discussion class, the United States continued with its offshore balancing role. So although the US military presence, unsurprisingly, is significantly downgraded as a result of the Cold War ending, the United States does not, by any stretch of the imagination, withdraw from Europe. The United States retains military bases in Germany, and although the US military footprint is significantly diminished, nonetheless, the United States remains a really important component of the overall European security system. Furthermore, there's this ambition, I think, to strengthen transatlantic institutions. I haven't put this on the slide, but in 1990, a transatlantic declaration was unveiled in which the United States and the European Union pledged to cooperate with one another. This was kind of strengthened for a little more in 1995 when a transatlantic agenda was unveiled, which again committed the European Union and the United States to cooperate in a number of areas. And these included, as I have on the next slide, promoting peace and stability, democracy and development around the world, responding to global challenges, contributing to the expansion of world trade and closer economic relations, and building bridges across the Atlantic. So there was this kind of, as I said, this desire for both sides of the Atlantic to continue to work together. Some writers in this period talk about the emergence of a transatlantic system, this idea that not just the economic systems, but the financial system, investment, you name it, have become very tightly integrated into this sort of wider transatlantic bloc in this time. And to some extent, the political institutions follow suit. So around this time, I think you witness a sort of institutionalization of the transatlantic relationship. For example, there's an agreement that there will be biannual meetings of the European Commission with the US government and other institutions which will actually kind of solidify the various sort of patterns of cooperation. So as I say, there was certainly this ambition to create this kind of more institutionalized transatlantic bloc. This slide for some reason seems to repeat a couple of points that we've just made, but yeah, the United States does reevaluate its relations with several European powers. We mentioned Britain, Germany, as I said, was sort of invited to play this role of partners in leadership. Some writers argue that it's in the course of the 1990s that Germany begins to behave as a sort of more normal power. I mean, one of the arguments is that during the Cold War, and maybe in the immediate years after the end of the Cold War, German foreign policy was deliberately sort of restrained. Partly, there's a sensitivity to the concerns of Germany's partners. Partly it's the fact that history weighs very heavily on Germany. So for these reasons, German policy is relatively restrained. I think Chancellor Kohl, who's Chancellor up until I think 1998, now he was a child of the Second World War, so he kind of experienced firsthand what the war had wrought in Germany. And I think he was, if you like, very conscious of the lessons of history. And that, as much as anything, I think kind of explains his commitment to continued European integration. Kohl finally leaves the political scene, as I say, in 1998. He's succeeded by Gerhard Schröder. We'll talk more about. I'll talk more about Gerhard Schröder in the next lecture, lecture number 10. But I think it's fair to say Schröder, a much younger man, part of the post-war sort of generation, perhaps less conscious, or certainly hadn't experienced, let's put it this way, hadn't experienced firsthand the impact that the war had had on Germany. And therefore, as I say, you get a sense that Germany, as I say, starts to behave more as a normal power in the sense of wanting to kind of protect and promote its own interests. The willingness of Germany to kind of contribute to European finances whilst playing a fairly sort of secondary political role, let's say, within the EU, that starts to wane. And I think it's around the late 90s and then certainly into the 21st century that Germany's weight, its political weight within the EU, begins to increase quite significantly, to the point at which, of course, today you've got Angela Merkel, who's obviously a very sort of central figure in European politics. Not much will happen in the EU unless she actually kind of signs on to it. Again, we mentioned several issues do create divisions between Europe and the United States. We mentioned some of the trade disputes over steel and farming and things which sort of kind of, I wouldn't say plague relations in the 1990s, but they do create some difficulties. But there are other wider political issues, global warming. I mean, even Clinton in the 1990s, despite having Al Gore as his president, was relatively cautious on the issue of global warming. I think maybe it was less Clinton's own political views, but the fact that he recognized that he needed to get Congress to sign on to any agreements that were eventually reached. In the end, the Kyoto Protocol is successfully negotiated. But by the time that happens, Clinton is leaving office. It falls to his successor, George W. Bush 43, to pick up the baton there, and Bush isn't interested in ratifying. And that kind of is a reflection that there are some quite distinct divisions between the Europeans and the Americans in terms of how pressing they viewed the issue of climate change. As I said, this is going back in the 1990s, so well over 20 years ago, and you could argue that not a whole lot has actually changed. International Criminal Court, again, similar sort of division, with the Americans being reluctant to fully participate in that. One of the reasons being that America contributed a lot of peacekeeping forces around the world, so there was this kind of fear that maybe American soldiers would find themselves put on trial or perhaps more vulnerable to accusations of committing crimes and things like that. So yeah, the International Criminal Court was another area, and there were others. So I mean, the point is that the 1990s. I mean, sometimes looking back at it today, we tend to view the 1990s as this halcyon period in transatlantic relations. And I think, in general, the relations between the Clinton administration and America's European partners were pretty good. But as I say, there were underlying areas of concern, and once Clinton's out of the way, and again, we'll talk about this in more detail in the final class. I think these issues become, if anything, even more salient. There are also, of course, the various debates surrounding NATO's purpose, NATO's role in the post-Cold War world. And one of the most important questions was the issue of NATO enlargement. After the Soviet Union withdraws from Eastern Europe after 1989, it becomes clear that the new post-communist states in East Central Europe, such as Poland, Czech Republic, etc., they all profess very publicly a desire to become part of the NATO alliance. There is some caution within NATO, though, in the first years, or certainly in the first half of the 1990s. There's a debate underway over the desirability of whether or not to extend NATO further eastwards. Clinton himself initially appeared relatively skeptical, but then for various reasons, Clinton basically changes his mind, I suppose, or at least becomes more enthusiastic about the issue of enlargement. It does actually feature in the 1996 presidential election. Bob Dole, the Republican candidate, comes out publicly in support of enlarging NATO, and eventually Clinton follows suit. One possible factor for this was that Clinton was conscious, if you like, of the ethnic vote. Lots of Polish Americans in the United States, who could be quite an influential bloc, and other nationalities as well. But I think there were sort of more hard-headed reasons as well to explain why Clinton eventually embraced the issue of NATO expansion, not least instability in Russia, the rise of Russian nationalist parties, things like that. That also caused growing concern within Western Europe. Either way, after 95, 96, Clinton finally commits to a limited NATO enlargement, and in 99, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary are finally brought into the alliance. But then there's also a wider debate about what NATO's role should actually be in the post-Cold War world. And from the US perspective, it was not enough for NATO to be simply a collective security organization or a defensive pact. It should be given a bigger role than that. And one of the slogans, which I think it was Senator Luja who comes up with this, but this phrase, out of area or out of business. In other words, NATO should not be limited to being a European security organization, but that it should kind of extend its area, its remit, if you like, beyond European frontiers. The third point, initiated reforms to give NATO a bigger out-of-area role. Yeah, NATO is sort of reformed. It's around this period that you get this phrase, coalitions of the willing, this idea that perhaps there will be situations, crises that NATO would have to respond to, which not all countries might want to willingly kind of participate in or contribute their military forces to. So there's this kind of recognition that there needs to be some sort of flexibility within NATO. One idea that they come up with are combined joint task forces, so CJTFs, which are basically sort of committees which could kind of come together, and various countries would sort of be able to kind of pool their assets. Then there's a sort of debate surrounding a European defence identity. And again, there's an element of American ambivalence about this whole debate. On the one hand, there's a feeling that, yes, it's good that the Europeans are taking security and defense seriously. On the other hand, there's this kind of underlying concern that this might have some kind of detrimental impact upon NATO. Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, warns about the dangers of the 3 Ds: delinking, duplication, and discrimination. Delinking mean effectively delinking NATO from Europe, duplication being a duplication of responsibilities and assets that essentially the EU would be copying what NATO was already doing, and warning about the dangers of discriminating against those members of NATO who weren't also EU members. So yeah, the Clinton administration does express some kind of concern about a European defence identity. On the other hand, I mean, the fact is that there was a clear sort of differential when it came to EU military capabilities and US capabilities. You know, the EU, even when it, you know, even the combined spending of the EU was still significantly less than the United States. And moreover, EU spending, there's also the fact that the amount of money that the European Union spend results in a sort of lot less in terms of purchasing. So yeah, the Europeans have much less spending power, if I can put it that way, simply because obviously EU is whatever it was back then, but 20, let's say roughly 20, 17, 18 states, all with their own respective defense policies and budgets and what have you, unlike the United States, which is a single entity and has a federal budget. So it's not just the case that the EU are spending less on defense, but it's also, as I say, that their defense spending, actually their purchasing power is significantly less than that of the United States. And as one official puts it in the 1990s, that Europe is described as being an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military pygmy. And I think that is probably quite an apposite way of describing the EU. So these debates are underway, and in the background you have the developing crisis in Yugoslavia. We've talked a little bit about this already, but again, I'll give you the sort of bare bones of how the crisis develops and the impact that this has on kind of European politics in the early 1990s. Famous quotation here from James Baker, in which he says, "We have no dog in this fight," meaning that there are no direct American interests at stake. The war basically begins in 92 when Croatia and Slovenia break away from the Yugoslav Federation. The following year, Bosnia also does the same. So just at the moment where the Europeans are developing their own common foreign and security policy, or aspiring at least to develop their own common foreign and security policy, you have this emerging crisis in the background. As I say, when at the beginning of the 90s, the pessimists were pointing to not just Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia, I suppose, was particularly prominent in that it was very close to the EU. Obviously, Yugoslavia shares frontiers with countries like Austria, Italy. So it was very visible. I mean, there were other parts of the former Soviet Empire as well, or former Soviet Union, the post-Soviet space, if I can put it that way, where you saw other sort of ethnic conflicts breaking out. You have Chechnya, for example, which becomes a major issue in the 90s. Conflict between Armenia, Georgia, etc. So the pessimists could point to this and say, look, this is the future. And as I say, to some extent, Yugoslavia becomes the common foreign security policy's first major challenge. You have a major security issue right on the doorstep of the European Union. So here is an opportunity for the European governments to respond to the crisis in a coordinated manner. The problem is that they don't. The problem is that when confronted with the crisis, the EU fails pretty abjectly, I would say, to respond effectively to the crisis. One problem is that the Europeans themselves are rather divided, and to some extent it kind of reflects their own sort of history or historical associations with the region. So, for example, Germany, which during the Second World War had Croatia had actually been an ally of Germany. So when Croatia withdraws, from Yugoslavia. Actually, I said 92. I think I meant it should be 91. Again, I keep getting the dates wrong. When Croatia withdraws from the Yugoslav Federation, Germany almost immediately recognizes Croatian independence. Something which it does, and it does this without consulting its European partners. So already, there are signs that there isn't going to be a sort of coordinated European response. In contrast, Britain and France, I wouldn't say they were pro-Serbian, but they were certainly reluctant, initially at least, to come too hard down on Serbia. I think the Brits, and to some extent the French, are hoping to find some kind of negotiated solution. Certainly, 1990, 91, the British are hoping that the Yugoslav Federation will somehow remain intact, that they will somehow that it will somehow avoid breaking up. And so they are not, British policy isn't overly enthusiastic when Slovenia and Croatia, and then the following year Bosnia, secede from Yugoslavia. In terms of their initial response, a United Nations protection force is dispatched to Yugoslavia on a peacekeeping mission. The problem is there isn't much of a peace to keep. Moreover, the force lacks heavy weaponry and becomes quite vulnerable itself to attacks by the various parties. In fact, some soldiers from the force were taken hostage. So the UN Protection Force becomes something of a sort of problem or a liability in the years ahead, as the EU and then NATO have to work out exactly how they are going to respond to this crisis. Another significant political initiative was the Vance-Owen Plan, named after the former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and David Owen, or Lord Owen, a former British Foreign Secretary. They had been tasked to come up with some kind of political solution to the conflict. I think the plan largely focused on Bosnia, and it presented the idea of dividing Bosnia into various small cantons, with some cantons being sort of like counties or small areas, and with some cantons having a Bosnian Muslim majority, others a Croatian majority, and still others, Bosnian Serb majorities. When the Clinton administration come in, they decide that they don't like the plan. In Clinton's ideas, it smacks too much of appeasement towards Serbia. So Clinton basically withdraws support for the plan. But the problem is that the Clinton administration don't have a better alternative to put in its place. But in 1993, Warren Christopher, the American Secretary of State, is dispatched to Europe to consult with the Europeans on how this crisis should be managed. The Americans propose lift and strike. Lift referred to lifting the arms embargo, which had been imposed on all the various parties in the former Yugoslavia. It was widely felt that this penalized the Bosnian Muslims and the Croatians because the Serbians had access to the Yugoslav army, which was relatively well equipped. So the idea was lift the arms embargo. That would allow arms to be kind of shipped into Bosnia to help the Bosnian Muslims. They also proposed limited airstrikes against various Bosnian Serbian artillery positions, particularly those deployed around the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Christopher goes to Europe, and it's an example, I suppose, of genuine consultation, simply because when it comes to it, it's not. He is actually genuinely asking for the Europeans' views. So whereas in the past, usually if a US president had come up with a policy, a Secretary of State or an emissary would be dispatched to Europe to tell the Europeans, this is what we're going to do, you better come on board. This time, as I said, it was genuine consultation. Christopher runs into a wall of European opposition. Most European governments do not think lifting the arms embargo at this stage would be a particularly good idea. And Clinton himself, his enthusiasm for the idea appeared to wane in the midst of Christopher's trip to Europe. So lift and strike, for the moment at least, was abandoned. A contact group was established involving the major European countries and the United States and Russia. So it was basically, I think it was the P4 countries, so the four of the 5 permanent members, so excluding China plus Germany, which allowed for a reasonably detailed consultation. The diplomacy continues. But the war rumbles on. There are more atrocities. There was little evidence that the conflict was likely to come to an end. And it's not until 1995 that NATO takes decisive action. Again, I think there are several reasons for this. One is there is a change in the presidency in France. The conservative politician Jacques Chirac is elected. And he is an avowed interventionist. He'd been very critical of Europe's and the West's response to the crisis in Yugoslavia. And it has been suggested that perhaps Clinton felt a little upstaged by the fact that you now have a very, fairly charismatic and quite vociferous European politician, as I say, advocating very strongly some form of military intervention. Even more significant, though, is the Srebrenica massacre in July 1995. Srebrenica was a town in Bosnia, supposedly a United Nations safe haven, as it was described. There was a small contingent of UN military forces, Dutch forces, deployed in the town. And then one day, a large number of Bosnian Serbs, militia or irregulars, turned up at the town and basically seized, underneath the noses of the Dutch military forces there, seized all the men from this town, carted them away and massacred them. And I forget exactly how many, but about 8,000 or 9,000, I think. I say men, but some of them were actually quite young, talking 15, 16 years old. And when this massacre is finally revealed to the world, public opinion hardens quite dramatically against the Bosnian Serb forces and the rump of Yugoslavia, which was dominated by Serbia. And finally, NATO does actually intervene. There are limited, again, there are airstrikes. NATO launches a series of airstrikes against Serbian positions. This is combined with a very successful Croatian military offensive in the Krajina region, which is a kind of strip of land between Croatia and Serbia. And for the first time since the war began, Serb forces suddenly found themselves in retreat, and that, as much as anything, brought the Yugoslav leader, Slobodan Milosevic, to the negotiating table. Should say the NATO intervention lasts about 48 hours, so it was a kind of brief intervention. But the war is ended when the various political leaders are flown out to Dayton, Ohio, and deposited in an American airbase. A treaty is drawn up, and finally the war is brought to an end. Richard Holbrooke was the US diplomat who oversaw the negotiations, and the result was a Croatian-Bosnian federation, and which results in an autonomous Serbian republic. Lessons from the intervention then. First and foremost, it certainly did reveal European political and military weakness. As I say, the initial attitude of the United States was that this was a European problem for the Europeans to solve. The problem there, of course, was that the Europeans proved incapable of managing or dealing with this, with this conflict. It certainly emphasize the continuing importance of the United States, and it does reverse American isolationist instincts. I think as a consequence of of NATO's intervention, there's an appreciation in the United States that America still has an important role to play when it comes to being a stabilizing presence in the European security system. It also increases support for NATO expansion. I think there's a feeling that actually pushing NATO further eastwards, if nothing else, it would help to stabilize other parts of Eastern Europe. It would also potentially provide bases which were geographically in closer proximity to places like Yugoslavia, where NATO or the European Union might have to intervene in the future. And as I said earlier, yeah, the Europeans realise, including Britain, that there is a definite need for an EU military dimension. That they recognise that they couldn't handle the crisis without the United States, and therefore it might be better in the future that the EU should have a more credible defence dimension. And as I mentioned earlier, this does end with Tony Blair and Chirac signing or coming up with the St. Malo Declaration, which eventually leads to a European security and defence policy at the beginning of the 21st century. Kosovo, which is the second major Yugoslav crisis that NATO has to deal with, and in some ways it's almost a sort of replay of Bosnia. Conflict and fighting really begins to flare up in Kosovo, I think late 1990s, around 1998, 1999. Kosovo is slightly different in that Kosovo itself was actually part of Serbia, so it was not an independent Yugoslav, or sort of semi-independent Yugoslav republic in its own right. Moreover, Kosovo, I think many observers of Yugoslavia thought that the conflict, the serious fighting would almost certainly begin in Kosovo. This was a sort of disputed area. Although Kosovo was part of Serbia, it was sort of 90% ethnic Albanian, Muslim Albanian. But historically, Kosovo was very, very important to Serbia. The Serbs lose quite an important battle in the 14th century there. So Kosovo is psychologically seen as very much part of Serbia itself. And Milosevic himself, the Yugoslav leader, who's sort of former communist, who sort of reinvents himself as a Yugoslav nationalist in the early 1990s, exploits the Kosovo issue. He uses the issue of Kosovo to strengthen his hands on the Yugoslav presidency. And in December 1992, the Christmas message is sent by the United States to Milosevic, warning him against intervening in Kosovo and indicating that were he to do so, the United States might feel compelled to intervene. So Kosovo is basically on the back burner for most of the 1990s, but late 90s, violence begins to flare up. Kosovo Liberation Army, a kind of armed group, appears on the scene. Attacks Serb police stations, things like that, Yugoslav police stations in the province, and almost trying to invite a retaliation on the part of Serbians, which of course they are very successful in doing. Television cameras begin to capture the images in Kosovo as well, and there is mounting international pressure to deal with the situation there. This time the West try and learn the lessons from the way that they handled the Bosnian crisis. The chief lesson they learned was to be much more decisive, much more early on. So this time, again, they invite all the parties to a conference in Paris. This time, Milosevic does not attend in person because there's an international arrest warrant out for him. But a Serb delegation or Yugoslav delegation is dispatched to Paris. They meet with the political leaders of forces. And a treaty is drawn up, which doesn't really satisfy any of the parties. The Kosovos want independence. The Serbs obviously want to keep Kosovo, as an integral part of a new Yugoslav or Serbian state. What was offered, though, was that Kosovo would become a sort of autonomous province, but still be part of but would remain part of Serbia, which is rather less than the Kosovo Albanians were hoping for. However, it's made clear to them that NATO would only intervene if they signed the treaty, so reluctantly they do so. The Serbs don't, and this paves the way for yet another NATO operation. And the expectation is that this will lead to, this again will be a relatively brief affair. NATO will just drop a few bombs, the Serbs will capitulate, and another peace agreement. It doesn't quite pan out that way. This war lasts much, much longer than anybody was expecting, 78 days, so about 11 weeks, which on the face of it doesn't sound too long, but much, much longer than, as I say, than they were actually expecting at the time. And as a result of that, because the war begins to drag, NATO itself experiences something of a crisis. Disputes break out over various things. One is disputes over NATO targeting, and particularly disagreements between the United States and and some European countries. The United States wanted a more aggressive targeting policy. The Europeans, to some extent, act as a sort of restraining influence. Moreover, NATO intervenes for humanitarian purposes, but the bombing campaign does nothing to stop Serbian atrocities in Kosovo itself. In fact, Serbian attacks kind of intensify. And the statistics there, an estimated 30,000 Albanians are killed, 1 million more are forced from their homes. They have to flee, so you have ethnic cleansing being carried out. Moreover, the legal justification for the war was ambiguous. There wasn't really a clear legal justification at all. In 1999, the United Nations Security Council couldn't pass a resolution authorizing military action because the Russians and the Chinese said they would veto any such resolution. And as I say, divisions sort of grow within the alliance. The United States become frustrated with, as they see it, war by committee. I mean, the Americans were basically saying, look, we're conducting 90% of the bombing sorties, and yet it is the Europeans who are seemingly telling us, what we are allowed to bomb and what we're not. And divisions also break out about how the war should be conducted. From the outset, Clinton insists that the war needs to be limited to a bombing campaign. Clinton insists that he does not want to deploy ground troops in Yugoslavia itself. But as the war drags on, there are increased voices saying that actually maybe sending in soldiers will be necessary. Maybe that will be the only way to end the war. Tony Blair in particular begins to advocate quite strongly for some kind of ground campaign. And that puts him on a sort of collision course with Clinton. So as I say, NATO itself descends into something of a crisis. I should also say, there were some NATO members who were very unhappy with the intervention at the outset, especially Greece and Turkey. So for all these various reasons, as I say, NATO does experience something of a crisis. However, eventually Milosevic does capitulate. I think there's sort of mounting pressure on him. Also, Clinton starts to indicate that he might, after all, be willing to send in ground forces to bring the war to a conclusion. So ultimately, despite the crisis, NATO does prevail, and the war in Kosovo comes to an end. So it's another example, if you like, of a reasonably successful sort of NATO intervention. And again, the same lessons were kind of learned from the previous intervention. Again, it kind of illustrated that the Europeans were heavily dependent upon the United States, that America still had a very kind of important role to play within the European security system. So at the end of the 20th century, as we noted, the United States retains an important presence in the European security system. The Europeans have pursued closer integration and shared values and shared security interests, robust institutions, all these things seem to indicate that at the end of the 90s and at the end of the millennium, if you like, the transatlantic alliance seemingly was in pretty good shape. So from that perspective, yeah, the worst forecasts of the realists did not seem to have come to fruition. The United States had not retreated into isolationism. Europe hadn't broken up. There hadn't been this significant renationalization of European politics. And when it came to it, NATO hadn't disappeared, and in fact had actually successfully intervened on two separate occasions to bring a pretty nasty war on the EU's doorstep to an end.